panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the basic building blocks of reality. Do we start with the physical world and consciousness pops out? Or do we start with consciousness and the physical world pops out? Physics is just kind of mathematical. For panpsychists, it's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations.
Just to interrupt you there, sorry, Philip, thank you for that. I think maybe for our viewers who might not be so familiar with panpsychism, maybe you could quickly elucidate your position, just briefly, and maybe from that explain how panpsychism or your position solves the hard problem of consciousness. So, in short, like what your main commitments are.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've jumped from physicalism to panpsychism, but I mean that's a good maybe initial way into it. Do we start? What comes first? Chicken or the egg? You know, what comes? Do we start with the physical world and consciousness pops out, or do we start with consciousness and the physical world pops out? A lot of people think of physicalism as, oh, that's the scientific story, but I would argue that actually, and we could get into this if you like, the scientific data is just neutral on all of these options. All of these options, for any scientific data, all of these different theories have a way of accommodating that data in their own terms. So I think we have to just explore these different options as philosophical options and see how they pan out. So that's the contrast, right? Do we start with physical stuff and consciousness pops out, or do we start with consciousness and physical reality pops out? So the panpsychist goes for that latter one. How on earth do we make sense of that? What, listeners or viewers might be thinking, well, how can we get physics out of consciousness? What does that even mean? And here we draw inspiration from really important work from the 1920s by the philosopher and Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell. I think of Russell as the sort of Darwin of consciousness. I think he kind of solved all the mysteries here. And Russell's essential insight was that physics is just kind of mathematical, right? Physics is just a load of mathematical structure. Stephen Hawking famously said, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe. So Russell said, look, physics is just maths, right? And in that sense, physics doesn't really care what's at the base of reality. All it cares about is that it has the mathematical structure, right? Whatever's down there, as long as it has the right mathematical structure, you're going to be able to get physics out of that. That's all physics is. So contemporary panpsychists build on this and think, well, hold on, if we can tell some story about consciousness, some story about little, very simple conscious things interacting in simple, predictable ways, and through their interactions, they make certain patterns, certain mathematical structures. And if we can get the right mathematical structures out of that, we'll get physics. So this points us the way forward to get physics out of some underlying story about consciousness. For panpsychists, it's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. So basically, I think we can't get consciousness out of physics, but we can get physics out of consciousness. We know that can be done thanks to Professor Russell.
Thank you. Yeah. Incidentally, I actually agree with you that consciousness is what breathes fire into science. However, I think we could focus on exactly what's missing here. And I think looking at neuroscience might be a good example, right? People think, or some responses to panpsychism, right, have been, well, we haven't actually gotten that far in neuroscience. As we do more research, we may be able to work out effectively exactly what creates consciousness and at what parts in the brain. Now, you don't think that's the full story, and maybe we can dive into the deep conceptual difference there, which really explains this difference between the behavior of matter that science looks at and actually what lies underneath, and what lies underneath the creation of consciousness in our brain.
Yeah. I mean, and one thing to point out that I've focused on in my book Galileo's Error, for example, that's somewhere behind me, shameless self-promotion, is, people have this idea, physical science is going amazingly. Of course it's going to explain consciousness. But if we take a slightly broader historical perspective, we find that actually physical science in an important sense kicks off with the father of modern science, Galileo, in the 17th century, taking consciousness out of science so that we can have a purely mathematical story, right? So Galileo had this idea. He wanted, for the first time in history, physics to be purely mathematical, science to be purely what he called natural philosophy. But the trouble was we get these qualities in experience, colors, sounds, smells, tastes that we can't capture in this purely quantitative mathematical vocabulary. So Galileo proposed a radical new philosophical worldview, right? He says, well, maybe all that consciousness stuff, that's outside of the physical world. That's outside of the scientific domain. Once we take that out, we can capture everything else mathematically. So the very project of physical science was premised on this separation of mathematical physics from qualitative consciousness. And I think, if we want to bring these two things together, we're going to have to look at something like panpsychism for unifying the two together. But just that was maybe a slight digression. Coming to your point is, what is it? What's the principled reason to think this can't be done? That physical science doesn't have the resources to do this? Because look, when you think about what is, and I think Galileo understood this very well. What is physical science in the business of? It's in the business of tracking behavior. What stuff does the behavior of complex physical systems? We take a complex, say, biological system, and we postulate mechanisms to explain the observable behavior. Ultimately, we get to the laws of physics. It's all about observable behavior out there in the physical world. But when we're interested in explaining consciousness, it's a different explanatory project, right? We're not trying to explain some observable behavior out there. We're trying to explain our feelings and experiences that we're sort of immediately acquainted with, that we only know they exist because we're immediately aware of them. So it's just a very different explanatory project. So I think it's a little bit like saying, telescopes are really good in astronomy. Maybe they'll be really good in pure mathematics as well. Well, no, it's just very different explanatory projects. And I think this is what Galileo realized at the start of the scientific revolution. We need to separate out these explanatory projects. And that went really well. That's gone really well. But I think people have forgotten these things were initially separated out, and they think, it's going to explain everything. Well, no, these are just very different kind of things we're aiming to do. So yes, physical science has been amazing. It's been amazing at explaining observable behavior, but that's not what explaining consciousness is all about.
Okay.
That was a bit long-winded. Sorry.
No, that was good. I want to make you go even further, because I think the way to do that is by taking it to an even simpler level. Because I still think we're a little bit too advanced in the conversation. Let's push it back a little bit. Panpsychism, and correct me if I'm wrong, is very, very basically the view that what we view to be inert matter or unconscious matter, like atoms, has some basic form of proto-consciousness on a very basic level, and that coming together, that creates more complex forms of consciousness, from cockroaches to plants, or rather from plants to cockroaches to humans. And I think maybe you could add to that a little bit, first of all, to kind of really flesh out what panpsychism is. And then maybe you could tell us why our current scientific view, or the view that most people hold, somehow is like has some form of cognitive dissonance to it. Why does the average person believe that the brain, that consciousness arises from the brain, and why is that so ingrained in kind of the general psyche, and how does panpsychism come into the picture?
Thanks, Lucas. You're an excellent host. You're bringing things down to brass tacks and the starting points I've skipped over. So panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the basic building blocks of reality. The way I like to talk about this is, if you think about human consciousness is very complex, the result of millions of years of evolution. But consciousness comes in different shapes and sizes, right? There's the consciousness of a sheep is simpler than the consciousness of a human being. The consciousness of a snail is simpler still. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of conscious experience. For the panpsychist, this keeps on going right down to the basic building blocks of matter, with electrons and quarks having incredibly simple forms of conscious experience to reflect their incredibly simple physical nature. And so, as you say, that from these very simple forms of experience we find at the level of fundamental physics, we build up in the human brain or the animal brain the incredibly complex form of experience we know and love. So then the question, what is the contrast with, I suppose, what is known as physicalism? Well, you said the consciousness comes from the brain. I mean, I don't deny that, right? I think, my consciousness is in my brain. That's, it's not, I don't believe it's something magical in the soul outside of the brain. I think my feelings and experiences are just processes in my brain. It's just that I believe those processes are built up from simpler forms of consciousness at lower levels of physical complexity. So I think there's undeniable stuff here that consciousness goes along with certain processes in the brain, right? That to my mind, that is the scientific task. The scientific task is working out which kinds of brain activity go along with consciousness. And that's something we've made progress on, although it's still a bit of a mess. We could talk about that. But that's not the full story, right? That's uncontroversial. Everybody agrees on that. The philosophical question is, why? Why does brain activity of a certain kind go with consciousness? Why do consciousness and the physical world have anything to do with each other? And the scientific data just leaves that open. And so we turn to these philosophical possibilities. Well, maybe that's because consciousness is at the base of reality and physical world emerges from that.
Sorry, could you just quickly re-explain there? Could you just quickly, just to hold you there for a second? Why is it not possible that a human has consciousness only coming from kind of material atoms that themselves don't have consciousness, that they come together to form a more complex form that we call consciousness, rather? Why can that not be the case?
Well, I mean, that's the crucial question that is debated here. But I think there are 2 points here, right? If I could just distinguish them. The first point I was making just now was simply that the scientific data, any scientific data from neuroscience, is neutral on this question. So this is not, people think physicalism is the sort of scientific option. No, the scientific data is just neutral, right? Science tells us, and to be honest, common sense tells us to an extent, that brain activity and consciousness are correlated, right? They go together, and the science tries to establish more specifics. And there are different philosophical ways of explaining that. Physicalism, panpsychism, dualism. But I mean, all of these philosophical options are empirically equivalent, right? You can't do an experiment to tell us which is right. So then you might say, well, we should just be agnostic. My colleague, philosopher of science, Peter Vickers, said, well, yeah, we should just be agnostic. You can't do an experiment to work out which is right, so we should just be agnostic. That's one option. But then don't go and say, you're a physicalist. Just say you don't know. You don't know whether physicalism or panpsychism or dualism are correct. But another option is to say, okay, the experiments can't decide it, but we can try and evaluate these theories in other ways. Do philosophy, right? And we can look at how well they, for example, explain what they're supposed to explain. So physicalists have been trying to explain consciousness. Panpsychists are trying to do it the other way around. And we just look at that, see how well they've done. And I would say panpsychism has done much better than physicalism, right? And so that is that ought to be the preferred option. And I think it's just kind of for cultural reasons, it feels a bit weird that, it's still a fairly minority view, although it's taken much more seriously than it was 10 years ago.
I'm going to move it to a bit of a speculative question, but before I do that, just to close up on maybe giving a bit of my personal journey with panpsychism, the bit that really clinched it for me in terms of understanding that distinction, which I watched your interview with Joe Rogan a long, long time ago. And I think there was a while in the interview where he was really struggling to get that difference between the correlation of the brain to the experience. So the bit that really clinched it for me at one point was the emergence problem, right? Which is that consciousness, right, if we assume that it isn't in fundamental particles, must come at some point as the system gets more complex. And I don't think there's any point where you can say you have, a system which is X amount of complex, right? And then you come in and you have a system which is X plus 0.001 more complex, and all of a sudden consciousness is there. That seems inexplicable to me. So I'll close off with that, but I'd like to ask you maybe about the implications of panpsychism for how we're looking at AI nowadays, right? Because if consciousness is already there and it's the emergence from these integrated systems, from these complex systems, there's two options. Either explain why AI isn't conscious, or bite the bullet and accept something that I think a lot of people would struggle to accept, which is that, AI either is or very soon can be conscious, so insofar as that system gets complex enough. So I'm wondering how you look at that.
Important questions. It's not straightforward. I think David Chalmers, who I mentioned earlier, who's more sympathetic to me on the philosophy, but would maybe have very different answers to those questions on AI. But I suppose the way I think about it is if you are a physicalist and you're probably more inclined to the view that being conscious is just a matter of information processing, complex processing of information in the brain. And so you're going to be more inclined to an openness to AI. AI could be something like we've got now, could be conscious if we just get the right kind of information processing. Whereas panpsychists, we don't think that consciousness is magical, but we think it's sort of the stuff of the world. It's not about organization and functioning. It's the flesh and blood of the world. And so I think artificial consciousness is because consciousness is not magical. It's going to be possible to make artificial consciousness, but I think we should be looking at something more like an artificial living system. Maybe something like a bacterium in the first instance, and then maybe in 5,000 years we get something like a human being or something. And I was at an AI summit recently with people, made ChatGPT and stuff, and we were going around the table and saying, when are we going to get general AI? And they were all saying 100 years, 50 years. And I said 5,000 years. And, but yeah, so maybe slightly different perspectives there. But although I was going to talk about artificial consciousness rather than artificial AI. I mean, I suppose that's another point of how we understand the relationship between intelligence and consciousness. Do those two things have to go together or not? That's another complexity here. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the basic building blocks of reality. The consciousness of a sheep is simpler than the consciousness of a human being. Consciousness of a snail is simpler still. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of conscious experience.
How can we conceptualize of a God that's of limited power and yet explains everything?
Traditional theism struggles with reconciling the terrible suffering we find in the world with an all-powerful, loving God.
Phillip Goff, you don't believe in hell. So what happens when we die? Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that clip from our interview with Phillip Goff. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Leave your comments down below too. If you'd like to check out the full-length interview, you can click right here. Thanks for watching once again, and see you next time.